Hello and welcome back to How to Draw a Cat Right in the Fur. We're getting closer to a title. So let's start out on another interesting part, and I don't think I've lost any video here, so you should be able to see me draw the whole eye. Yay! So all I'm doing here is I'm going to start with extra soft charcoal, and I'm just kind of doing the outline of the pupil. I'm going to leave a little spot in the top of that for the reflection. Now, while I'm doing that, notice there's a mistake here in this drawing that I don't think I ever fixed, but I'm actually kind of fine with it. The pupil on the left-hand side is at the wrong angle. I should have actually pulled out the black from that pupil further into the iris and corrected that. It's more of an angle than what I have it in the reference photo, and it also pulls a little bit further into the eye. Fortunately, it's not far enough off to where it changes the look of the cat, so I end up leaving it, but this is one of those things in hindsight I wish I would have changed. It's also one of those things where as an artist I know better than to stare at my own work after I'm done for long periods of time. There's a benefit to it in that I can find mistakes and know in the future to correct them, but it also makes me obsess over those details and make me think, I wish I would have done this. I wish I would have done that. I wish I could have gone back and corrected this and this and this. You can't let yourself obsess over that. Learn from mistakes, take note of it, but don't obsess over it. Otherwise, you could end up in a position like I occasionally find myself in, where I go back over my old drawings, find the ones that I'm not super happy with or aren't exact, and I just straight up destroy them and throw them away. In fact, I think I destroyed 10 drawings just last week that were old and just didn't live up to my standards. So now I'm going to go back along the edge of this eye with hard charcoal, and very, very lightly I'm just putting in kind of the outline of the eye here, because there's an outline, it's kind of a ridge that happens along the eye, and we're just going to blend that out with a somewhat clean blending stump. We don't want to have a bunch of black on the blending stump because it'll make a big thick black eyeliner looking outline, and we don't want that. So using small circles, I'm just going to start lightly blending out from the ridge that we just drew and into the iris of the eye. And that's going to give us a base coat for the background layer of the eye itself. Once we have that on and we get the right sort of tone there and the right sort of contrast, we can worry about adding details to this eye later. Now this eye specifically has less detail than the one that faces the camera. So we don't have to go crazy with detail here. And in fact, if we keep mainly just the background here, it's going to look like light catches that one a little bit harder and make it look a little bit more glassy. Now I'm paying attention to a couple different things here. The first and the most important is the shape. Now that's the mistake that I just explained earlier on the left eye, our left eye, is that I got the shape wrong, which means the angle of the pupil is wrong. But the thing is, if I can kind of mimic that angle in the right eye, it won't show up as much. If I get one wrong and one exactly right, the cat's eyes are going to look lopsided. So part of what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the reference photo to make sure I'm fairly on target. I'm also looking at the cat's other eye to make sure that it doesn't look like it's got like lazy eye. It'll look like one eye's looking one way while the other one's looking another. So I'm trying to balance out between both of these eyes to make sure it's looking in the same direction. The tricky part is that there's that little reflection that happens right on the top of the pupil going into the iris. That can trick you into thinking that you have lopsided irises to begin with because you're not drawing in that area. So you kind of have to do a little bit of projection here. You kind of have to project where that iris and where that pupil is going behind the reflection in order to get this right. Now, if you decide that you want to take this a little bit darker on the eyes, it'll make the reflection itself pop out way more. The darker the background, the brighter and sharper the reflection will look in things like eyes, glass, water, and whatnot. I'm trying to fairly closely match what I'm seeing in the reference photo just because this is a commission and I want to make sure it looks as real as possible. I don't want to do too much modification on this drawing because I don't want to accidentally change the personality of the cat and the look and the shape of the cat. I want the owner to be able to recognize this as their specific cat whenever they get it, and not just one that's similar. Anytime you see me touching paper like that, it's not something I suggest you do unless you know your hands are extremely clean and you have an extremely precise touch. But what I'm doing there is I'm lifting off pieces of eraser. Now the way that I can do that, if I have eraser little shreds or crumbs or whatever into an area that I've already drawn, is to take a Q-tip that's extra fuzzy, one that you just mess up the tip, and it has to be really clean. Barely touch the paper with the Q-tip and spin it in place, and it'll lift up the little shards of eraser or little crumbs of eraser. But if they're on white paper, especially if it's going to be in an area where I know I'm going to draw a little bit more later on, I'll just press my finger into it and pick it up just like you're picking up breadcrumbs. Now we're going to back up into the area that we've already drawn into the fur with a Q-tip. And this is a somewhat dirty Q-tip, and I'm just darkening this whole area. I'm not worried about losing detail here because this is not going to be super detailed to begin with. All I'm trying to do is add a little bit of darkness to this area so that the white areas that are to the right of it pop out a little bit better. And this is where I start to do things like building layers and looking at what I'm drawing versus what I've already drawn and modifying those things as I go. Now, as we get deeper into the drawing, I have to do that less and less because I get more and more accurate with those areas that I've already drawn. Every time we add another layer of modification, it gets a little closer to the truth. And notice what I'm not doing. I am not drawing in individual hairs with a pencil. If I did that, this would immediately look artificial and weird. I'm just using the Q-tip to simulate hair because since the Q-tip is not a sharp uniform object, the little pieces of fuzz and material that come off of the Q-tip are like a little microscopic pencil in themselves. So whenever I put extra soft or hard charcoal onto this and I start making strokes with this, it's going to give the illusion that I've drawn in hundreds of little tiny individual hairs even though I haven't. It's just the texture of the Q-tip creating the illusion of really soft fur. Now once I have that done, I'm going to bounce down into the nose, which sounds like a really weird thing to say, but I want to bounce down into the nose and I want to start laying in the most basic generic shadows I can here. The only thing I'm worried about here is getting the shape of the shadow correct and making sure that I'm giving myself an area full of landmarks. So I want to be able to look at the nose and the bridge of the nose and the cheek and know that whenever I'm looking at the reference photo, here's where it relates on the drawing. And so all I'm doing is creating shapes here. I can worry about darkening areas and lightening areas a little bit later. I can worry about adding some more, some sharper details a little bit later. I just want a shape, and that's it. I never obsess on details right off the bat. The exception to that could probably be the eyes. I love drawing eyes, which I think most artists do, and so I put a lot of detail into the eyes right off the bat, but that's just force of habit. With everything else, I typically do it in layers, then I modify, then I do another layer, then I do some correction, and just bounce back and forth until it gets the way I want it. So here I'm taking a blending stump and I'm just kind of making slash marks underneath the eye, because it's hard to tell in this reference photo, but there's a little bit of a ridge where some hairs, individual pieces of fur start to make themselves a little bit known, a little bit more individualized, hair by hair, or at least small clumps of hair by small clump of hair. So I just kind of made some light slash marks, and then if anything gets too dark or too clumpy, I can modify that with a Tombow eraser, which I did a minute ago. And now, just using the side of the blending stump, I want to start pulling some of those shadows that I created earlier into the rest of the face, and I'm going to start to modify those shapes and correct them and add a little bit of definition to them. But I don't use a pencil here, because if I use a pencil, one, I'm creating pencil marks, which makes it look way more drawn. And the other thing is, blending stumps are fuzzier than pencils. They have a softer touch. So whenever I add the fur in with a blending stump, the fur is naturally going to look softer. If I need to do bristly hair with like a dog that's got really, really sharp, coarse hair, like maybe a Labrador, if I start using a pencil there, the hair will look a little bit more bristly and coarse because the pencil has a sharper stroke. Now, if you're going for more of like a comic book style or a minimalist style, you could stop modifying this right here and just finish the rest of the drawing exactly the way it's sitting now. Like the body of the cat would be done in the same style as this top, and you could get away with that and it would still look cool. But I'm going for something that's a little bit more refined and a little bit more definition. The thing with my art is I don't sell a lot. I live in a very small town and we don't have an artistic community here. There's no gallery within 2 to 3 hours drive from my house. So if I have to sell art locally, which that's where I make most of my money from art, I have to do something that's different from everybody else. And most artists won't go through the steps of putting in really fine, tedious detail because they need to get drawings done quickly, and that means doing basic shadows and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with that, but I have to have something that puts me outside of that group of artists so that I have something special that makes me unique. And in my area, that's adding in all this extra detail. And right now, it's not looking all that detailed, right? It's looking pretty chunky and clunky, but it will. It will be way more defined here in just a little bit, especially whenever I get to putting those backgrounds in. So one secret from me to you. The thing that makes my drawings sell the most, it goes hand in hand with the detail thing I just said, is I take the extra time to do the background. One of the things that makes my drawings look photographic, even though this right now does not look photographic, is putting in a background. I could draw just this cat on white paper and it would be fine, or I could just do a solid gray gradient background and it would be fine. But the fact that I go through and take the extra, however long it takes, a couple hours, sometimes a couple days, to do a detailed background is what makes my stuff pop out. It's almost tricking the person into thinking that my drawings are more realistic than they actually are, because they're not used to seeing someone take the time to draw the blanket or the wall behind them, or my landscapes often have a really blurry background that creates the illusion of depth. I'm doing the same thing here. I'm going to grab extra soft charcoal, and I'm just drawing in the darkest parts of the nose right now, and I'm using tiny little circles to draw the blackest parts of these shadows. All the rest of the nose here, I'm just going to use a blending stump, blend together the extra soft charcoal that I just used, and pull that around where I want it. So as I'm doing this, the blending stump is getting dirty and turning into its own pencil. So I don't need to add more charcoal to this area in order to create that nose. I'm just moving charcoal around and making sure that the shape is correct on this nose. And the more I use this blending stump, the softer that area is going to look. It's all about keeping as little pencil marks on the page as possible. I don't know if I phrased that right. Let me rephrase that because words are hard. It's all about having as little pencil marks as possible. The smoother we can get this to look, the more realistic it's going to look overall. So I just use the blending stump to kind of scrub in that area and make sure that the shapes are correct. And then if we need to modify that a little bit later, we can. But the most important thing, just like I keep repeating with the rest of this drawing, make sure the shapes are right first. Then we can modify. The shapes are the most important part when doing a commission like this because the owner will be able to tell a difference between what you drew and what their cat really looks like in real life. I'm going to call it another happy accident, but like as I'm narrating this, I'm looking at those eyes and thinking I really should have expanded those those pupils. And I'm going to be thinking it for the rest of my life. But there's a happy accident there where it looks like the cat has widened its eyes and is in kind of play mode. I don't know if you've ever noticed before, but whenever your cat starts to get into I want to attack this ball of yarn mode, its eyes will actually dilate. It'll get bigger, but it'll also widen its eyes like it's almost turned psychopathic. The pupils here aren't dilated, but its eyes are widened, and if you combine that with the posture of its leg down on the bottom of the drawing, it looks like it's getting ready to get into play mode where it wants to slap around a ball or whatever. I didn't intend for that to happen, but we will take that happy accident with pride. The funny thing is the fix for that's pretty simple. I just take a blending stump and start pulling that black from the pupil into the iris, and it will automatically expand that out a little bit. It wouldn't take more than a minute or two to correct that whole area. But again, I'm not going to complain if it, worked in our favor. So now I'm just taking a blending stump, and I'm not getting into fine detail here, but I am adding in some more shadows using kind of a very deliberate back and forth or diagonal stroke here. So what that's going to do is it's adding in shadows, but only in strips. So it kind of incidentally adds highlighted hairs. So I'm just going to add that in quickly, and it's going to look really rough, but to me, whenever we're first doing this, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that if you wanted to keep that minimalist and look really hand-drawn, you could do the fur like this with a blending stump and just add in those little strokes quickly and with like kind of dragging or stabbing motions, and you could create hairs with highlights that way, and it would be totally fine. What I'm doing is just the beginning stages of the fur to where I can add those in and then go back and refine those later. So while I'm down in this area, I'm going to take the blending stump, and it's fairly dirty. It's not jet black, but it's got quite a bit of charcoal on it. And I'm just going to start adding in the little dots where its whiskers meet its face. And that's a really, really good landmark to have on there because I can look down and at a glance, those things pop right out. And I know exactly where I am within this drawing. So I'm going to throw those in there kind of quickly just to give the ideas, and then I can refine those later just like I keep repeating. I'm so sorry for repeating, but that's a big part of teaching. Throw them in, refine them later. And now check that out where the more of those I add in, even though they're extremely rough, that cat's face is starting to come alive already, and we're starting to get a a really good definition. And we're starting to get some really good shapes, and we can see the curvature of its face. Part of that is those little dots on its face underneath its nose have a shape of their own. They sort of point out a contour. And then while I'm down there, I can start scrubbing in minor shadows around those with a blending stump to add even more curves and even more shape. Now this part I have to be kind of careful on because I could very easily get lost in the details here and then spend a massive amount of time on just this one section. And I don't want to get into like final touch-up mode. I want to get the idea in and then move on. So I dirtied up that blending stump again, fairly dark, and I'm just going to drop in the bottom shadow of its top lips. And so, do cats have lips? I assume so. It's cat mouth face. I'm going to drop that in just to kind of define that out. And so now we're adding another layer of depth and shape. And it's crazy because this is only one tiny little line that we're throwing in. Again, not with pencil, just with a blending stump because that makes it soft. But it's suddenly turning into a cat as we add this one tiny little nothing of a line in there. It's such an important section because as we add that in and the cat's face starts to take shape, it's also going to define how our other shadows lie, the shapes of those shadows and the darkness and the contrast of the shadows versus light. So I'm just adding that in quickly. I'm making it kind of dark here because that chin is pretty dark. And then we're going to start modifying a little more and then maybe jump into the body and the color. When I say color, it's the one around its neck and not the non-existent color that would be in there. Now I'm still doing the thing that I was complaining about earlier where I'm still trying to force negative space around these whiskers. I'm going to go ahead and say in this video, which I kind of alluded to it before, I'm going to say straight out, don't use negative space for whiskers at all. I would leave those alone and pretend that they don't exist and just shade that entire area as if the cat had no whiskers. Then the very final step in the drawing, after you've done the whole cat, the whole background and everything, then drop those in with a Tombow eraser. If you don't have a Tombow eraser, you may be forced to use a little bit of negative space to create those because that's an extremely sharp area that we have to take out of there. If you don't have a Tombow, it's called, the one that I use is called a Tombow Mono Zero eraser. It's a 2.3 millimeter eraser and it operates just like a mechanical pencil. I think I paid $6 for mine. It wasn't much, and that included shipping, and it came with like 3 refills. They're not expensive at all. I used this as one of the most important tools in my drawing, and it wouldn't matter if I was doing charcoal like you see here or graphite. I would use that thing constantly. It's an extraordinarily awesome way to put in highlights, whiskers, reflections in the eyes, all kinds of, like cleaning up edges of like sharp edges of objects. It's a really good way to clean those up. I don't like messing around with a kneaded eraser and trying to pull a sharp point into it or knead a sharp point into it. Anyway, if you don't have one, it's worth considering. So I'm just going to take a Q-tip and start blending together these shadows, but I'm blending kind of light because I don't want to lose the texture I created, but I need to soften those areas up and I need to darken those shadows around that right side of the eye. So I'm just kind of lightly dropping in a little bit of shadow and doing a little bit of blending work in those areas. The more you do this, the softer the fur will look. But also keep in mind that the more you do this, the more detail you will lose. So I'm just being a little bit careful. Light touch, blending, adding in a little bit of very, very, very light, subtle shadows under the eye. And then even though I know this whole area needs to become much, much darker, we're just doing kind of step 2 in those shadows. Now with the blending stump, I'm going to go back into the main like ear and forehead of the cat. And again, very lightly, I'm going to start adding in little single strokes around those ears. And that's to define some of these clumps of hair. I'm also going to grab not extra soft, but hard charcoal, and with that barely touching the paper, and I mean barely, it needs to barely make a mark. I'm just adding a couple lines in that clump of hair that overlaps the ear, because I can't quite get the definition that I need with a blending stump, but if I barely touch the paper with hard charcoal, I can define those hairs out a little bit, or clumps of fur, and make them appear more detailed than they actually are. Now I'll do the same thing with the hairs that cross over in front of the ear, the ones that go horizontally. But I'm being really selective about which hairs I put that sort of outline on. I call it an outline, but it's not really. I'm more defining the shadows that lie behind those clumps of hair rather than defining the hairs themselves. It's the same thing, technically. But your perception, the way you look at this inside your mind, will change the way you see the drawing, and it'll change kind of your target on what you're drawing on. So what I mean by that is if my perception is I'm modifying the background behind these hairs, then I'm going to start looking at the background as an overall entity, and it'll kind of dictate how I do the rest of that background. And when I say background, I mean the flat part of the inside of the ear. So now I'm not really working on things like, oh my gosh, I've got to put a shadow on this single individual hair. It's more just like, okay, all I'm doing is darkening up that background a little bit and making it a little sharper. Perception is everything whenever you're doing this. Now let's grab a Tombow eraser and go back to the top of the head, and we're starting in the white area and pulling into the dark area to make it appear that these little hairs are sticking out and overlaid over the top of that background. This will be one of the most realistic looking parts of the drawing when we're all done, because people will wonder how you got that. Well, non-artists will wonder how you got those sharp hairs to look that way. Then we'll just jump into that ear real quick, and we're just adding a little bit of highlight in areas that need a wider border. So you'll notice in that right ear that it's almost like it's outlined in white. So we're just kind of sharpening that up a little bit and we're kind of exaggerating that white border in order for it to look a little bit more real and pop out a little bit better than it already has. Now, before I get stuck into the crazy amount of detail up there, I stop myself and move on. At no point do I want to get myself into the mode where I'm just being finicky in one area. I want to get that idea done and then move on to another so that I can progress in this drawing rather than being stuck on one thing like an ear for the next 2 hours. It's why I keep repeating the idea of getting the idea of an area put in and then moving on and refining it later. If I get myself stuck on one area of this drawing for too long, I'm going to burn myself out, and then I'm going to see an area that's really defined and almost picture perfect and ready to seal. I'm going to compare it to all the other areas that are not like that, and it's going to be frustrating because in my head, personally, I'm going to think, oh my God, I've got so much more work to do on this cat. I just spent 2 hours on this little 3 by 3 inch section, and now I have the whole rest of this page that I need to do the same thing on. I have to train myself mentally to be able to move on from an area and to not burn myself out. It's how I can do so many details and spend so much time on a drawing without going crazy. Now I'm just going to pop around the fur while I've got that blending stump in hand and kind of add in, not really more detail, but I'm kind of adding a little bit of bulk to some of these shadows. But I'm doing it in strokes, that way I can create the illusion that that hair exists. Jump up into the ear, do kind of the same thing along that little ridge, darkening up some shadows, pulling them and shaping them into the way I want. This is a little bit finicky, but as we get deeper into this drawing, the more finicky we're going to get with these, in order to try to recreate as best we can the illusion of hair, shape, and getting things closer to the way it would look in real life. Now along the ridge of the ear on that left side, I'm just I'm making little pokey marks. Weird phrasing. Anyway, to make it look like there are tiny little almost microscopic looking hairs that stick out on the ridge of the ear. Just quickly throw them in, move away. Now we'll add another layer of darkness to this part of the shadow. Now this is what I pointed out in another video. The area that I'm working in right now is a little bit darker from a circular area just down to the left of that. And so I'm trying to separate these two areas just enough to where that area in the middle, I'll circle it down in the reference photo, that needs to be the tiniest bit lighter than the shadows that are around it. So I'm not going too crazy with this just yet, but I'm trying to create a little bit of separation. Now I switched to a fatter blending stump here because I can blend more area a little bit quicker. And the other thing is I'm not trying to add a bunch of fine hair details here. So I'm kind of blending that area together using that fatter stump, and I'm also adding a layer of darkness. If I use a sharp pointed blending stump in this area and I continue making those strokes, I'm eventually going to build up a big giant area that's really kind of almost bristly. It's got too many hairs that are defined. So sometimes I switch to either a fatter blending stump or a Q-tip to do more mass area so that I don't overdo it. Now I wanted to finish out the shape of this cat's face for the most part, and the easiest way for me to do that is to start dropping in that pitch black color underneath its chin, around its neck. So I grab extra soft charcoal and I'm going to start scrubbing that in, and I'm going to scrub in some really black areas that have little points of hair that pop into the cat's lower jaw. And that's going to make it look like the opposite. It's going to make it look like the cat's lower jaw, the fur on that, is appearing over the top of that collar. So what we're doing is drawing the collar itself as a solid black and then pulling that slightly into the face itself. And you'll see me doing that here in a second, where with quick, sharp strokes, I just draw tiny little lines that overlap that. And whenever I'm done, it's going to make it look like the fur sits on top of that collar and is obscuring the top part of it. I'm not worried about getting solid here with that black either. I need to get the basic idea of that in, and then I can go back in with either a Q-tip or it would make more sense to do it with the blending stump and blend that together, and it will become really dark, and you'll lose all those little pinholes that are created with extra soft charcoal. The contact between extra soft and textured paper, even if there's barely any texture on there, will always create pinholes. So I'm doing exactly that now. I'm taking a blending stump and taking out all those little pinholes and pencil marks, and then kind of pulling that a little bit into the fur on the cat's face, and we're going to soften all that area up. That tiny little thing that I just did completely shaped that cat's face. That blows me away. I've been doing this since 1976. And so it's not a short amount of time that I've been doing it. But that still amazes me on things like white fur, that such a minor, tiny little detail can totally define an area. So what I'm going to do here is start to work on the shadow on the cat's body. And instead of loading up that blending stump, and I'm using the fat one, instead of loading that up with charcoal, I'm just jumping into the black area that I just drew with the extra soft charcoal and picking up charcoal from that and pulling it right down into the white fur. You don't really have to worry about losing detail along the edge of that, because if that has a really sharp detail there anyway, it's going to look weird. It needs to kind of blend into the shadow. Look at the reference photo, how it just kind of disappears. You don't see a defined edge along that bottom. It goes from jet black into like a really dark gray. So all I'm doing is scrubbing both the white area and the jet black area with that same fat, I keep wanting to call it a Q-tip. It is not a Q-tip, Adam. It is a blending stump. So I keep scrubbing into that area with the blending stump and then using that to create the shadows. Now that that's really dirty like that and really loaded up with extra soft charcoal, I can start to darken up the shadows along its chin, along its top lip, and use that dirty blending stump to my advantage. So I'm taking charcoal from one area of the drawing and placing it on another area of the drawing. We'll use the same exact method to start to darken up the shadows along that cheek and along the side of its jaw. If I ever need to clean off a blending stump and I need to get it less dirty so that I can do more subtle gray areas, this is one of the ways that I do it. Instead of just rubbing that off on scrap paper or a microfiber cloth, I'll just go into areas that definitely need darkened and clean it by using the charcoal that's on it rather than just wiping the charcoal off. It just makes your materials last longer. I mean, otherwise I'm dirtying up a blending stump and then wiping the stuff off, then adding more, then wiping it off. Try to use what you've got on the blending stump. If you have an area that needs darkened and your blending stump is already dirty, why not just jump into that area and use it? Now that I've darkened the shadows on the side of its face, which definitely need darkened even more, it dictates how dark or how light the shadows look everywhere else. So I'm just grabbing a Q-tip and adding another layer to these subtly gray areas that are on top of its head that go into the side of its face, and just adding an additional layer there. I'll end up modifying that a lot by the end of the drawing. Everything that you're doing affects everything that you've done. Now, really important here, whenever I'm adding in some extra shadows or I'm kind of darkening an area, I'm always scrubbing in the direction that the fur quote-unquote flows. If the fur goes horizontally, all my strokes are going to be horizontal. If the fur runs vertically, all my strokes are going to be vertical, because we're using the texture of the Q-tip to create the illusion of hair. All we have to do is give that Q-tip direction, and it will make it look like the cat's fur runs in that direction. Now I'm just going to go into the area that I've already darkened, start in the lightest part of the cat's face and pull out over the top of that dark area to make it look a little bit more defined, like these little hairs are overlapping that area and are closer to the camera than the dark area. So I'm just putting those in kind of quickly, very light, very sharp, quick strokes. Occasionally I'll pull that Tombow eraser up and just kind of clean it with my fingers, because you will pick up a little bit of dark charcoal on that eraser, and it'll start to make dots in your white area where you put the eraser down and start to pull. So I do have to kind of clean that off quickly, just by pinching it and twisting the eraser in my hand. But you can see just that little tiny bit of stuff that we just did there has kind of defined that area a little bit more. There's almost no detail in this area at all, but it looks like it's created the optical illusion that the cat has individual clumps of fur, individual hairs that reside in that area. It makes it look more realistic, and we've done hardly any work at all to that area. It's just a big black blob, another gray blob, a little bit of erasing, and a Q-tip. I mean, it's not hardly any work at all, really. We'll go back up into that left-hand shadow and do a little darkening and a little smoothing at the same time. just by using a somewhat dirty Q-tip. We're just kind of, modifying shapes, smoothing it out, darkening it up a little bit. When I talked earlier about laying in the idea of something and then going back to modify it and refine it later, this is the later part where we're starting to add a little bit of refinement to this area just to make it a little closer to reality. We're not going to dive in and go into finishing touches or anything like that. We don't want to spend a ton of time here. Just a little bit of modification and then move on. Now we'll modify the cat's forehead, and keep in mind we're doing that same thing where as we're scrubbing in the idea of these shadows, we're also following the flow of the fur. And it goes vertical, pretty much almost entirely vertical in the forehead, but it also has a little bit of curve to it. Bounce back down into the face itself along that left side and do the same thing. Now, before I get too into that, again, get away from it before I get locked into doing all those details. I'm going to go back into the side of the face and start defining the hairs that overlap the background just by putting tiny little scratch marks with the eraser on that edge. I kind of need to go back in and define a little bit of the edges of that eye because there's a lot of shadows and little hairs here that are finicky. And so I'm just very, very lightly laying in a few of those clumps of hair in order to start to define the shapes of those shadows. And this area is a little bit more complex than the normal shadows that we're doing. And one of the reasons is because since that's a focal point, everything around the eye needs to be not overdone, and it needs to be fairly sharp. So this happens to lie in an area where some of the shadows are extremely thin between these clumps of hair. Some of the highlights are extremely thin, and I need to make sure that it's not just slapped in there. I'll take a Tombow eraser and go on the highlight part of its cheek there underneath the eye. And I'm just starting the white area and lightly pulling into the dark area the same way we did with all the other overlapping hairs. Because that's a layer of fur that goes over the top of that shadow. So we're just adding in a little bit more definition. I'm starting to do the same thing along the side of its cheek. Now this is one area that you're not going to be able to tell in the reference photo, but there are a few stray hairs or clumps of hairs here and there that stick out with their own highlight. So I'm just kind of randomly adding those in. Then I'm going to define the edge of that shadow with some more overlapping hairs. It's another area where I had to tell myself, back away, do your thing, and move on because you're going to get stuck. Now, anytime that I darken with a blending stump in a large area, I don't use the point of the blending stump, I use the side. I lay it almost as flat as it can get, and then I just use a light touch to create that extra area of darkness. So that's what I'm doing here. I don't want to have a bunch of defined fur shadows. I don't want to have a whole bunch of dark lines that go through here. So I just dirty up that blending stump by rubbing it in extra soft charcoal that I have on scrap paper. Then turn that thing sideways. I almost did a rock saying there. Okay. Then turn that sideways and then just start kind of lightly scrubbing back and forth in the direction that the fur flows. And we're just darkening up a much broader area of the cat's face. So the goal here is not detail. The goal here is to darken a section, but we just have a little bit more control with the blending stump than we do with a Q-tip. We don't want to totally soften this area, which would happen if we keep going over it with a Q-tip. Now I'm correcting the shape of that tiny little subtle highlight that happens. I'll circle that in the reference photo too. It was too thick. And so all I'm doing is just adding the same exact technique we've been using, but just pull it into that highlight a little bit more to make that shape match the reference photo a little bit better. Then while I've got that in hand, I can start defining a little bit of the other shadows that happen around the top part of its face. And now we're getting into a little bit heavier refinement than what we've done before. The darker that we get this area, the more realistic that's going to look, but only up until a certain point. If I start using pencils here and I get this really dark, like as dark as the collar underneath its chin, it's going to get so dark that it's going to look goofy. It's going to look unrealistic. So we can go darker than what the reference photo is showing, which we don't end up doing that. We keep the whole thing lighter than that. But for example, if I wanted to go that dark and then cross a line and get even darker, we could, but there's going to be a point to where it gets so dark it masks the realism. It stops looking realistic and starts looking like a comic book type of drawing. If that is what you're going for, then you could totally do that. Basically, it removes layers of shadow and starts producing 1, 2, 3 kinds of layers of tone. Whereas this, whenever we're doing shadows the way we're doing it, we're creating more of a gradient. So there are hundreds of different levels of shadow within each one of these groups. We don't consciously put 100 layers of shadows, but as we're doing a gradient from dark to light, it's naturally going to produce a more of a variance in tone overall. So using the blending stump, now I'm going to start defining the hair along the top of its face. Again, not with a pencil, but using the blending stump allows this fur to stay soft while still adding detail to these little clumps of fur. So all I'm doing is I'm getting a dirty to a semi-dirty blending stump. And whenever I say dirty, I just mean I'm putting extra soft charcoal on it by scrubbing it in scrap paper. Then I'm going to use that as if it was a pencil, and I'm just being kind of light with my touch, and I'm putting in soft little strokes. As I get into the white part, the really reflective part of this cat's fur, I'm going to ease up my pressure to where these things get lighter and lighter until they just completely disappear. Now the same thing in this little corner of the ear, I drop down the shadow a little bit further into the cat's head because a highlight that I had there stuck out too far. And then all I did was after I pulled that shadow into that area and corrected that shape, then I just have to kind of redraw or re-erase those little stray hairs that overlap it. Very, very quick fix. So now, these were all landmarks at one point before. So like I would put a little hooky shadow in here because it's something that stuck out to me on the reference photo. I drop it in and then not do anything around it because that allowed me to remember where I was within the drawing. Now that we're done with needing landmarks in that area, I'm just starting to connect all these shadows with the blending stump and not worrying about the landmarks anymore. They've served their purpose. I no longer need them to navigate that area. So I'm just taking a blending stump and blending all this area together to create one mass shadow. When I'm done with that, I can go back into other areas like these areas of the ear and add a little bit of depth to those, a little bit of darkness to the background hairs and things like that. But this is all just refinement, refinement, refinement. This is not finishing touch refinement though, and I know I've mentioned that a couple times too, but it's important to keep in mind I'm not spending so much time in here that this thing is done and ready to seal. All I'm doing is refinement and getting it closer and closer to the finished product. If you ever need to get a line with a blending stump that's a little sharper and a little darker than what you're able to get by scrubbing, you can push it in a stabbing motion and it will make naturally a little darker and a little sharper line than normal. And the reason is because I don't know. I don't know. I don't know the science behind it. It just happens to make sharper, darker lines if you push it into the paper rather than pulling it across the paper. I don't do that very often. I do it whenever I'm needing to do a very sharp, more defined shadow between hairs, typically. Now we're going to pop down into the area on the cat's upper jaw, to the bottom left of that nose, and we're just going to kind of define that shadow a bit and smooth it out, because I can't say defined, I had very defined borders along that shadow to begin with, and it was too defined. And so we're just going to kind of add a little bit of a gradient to that and pull it up into the cat's face a little bit better. Now we can go back up into that area that's to the bottom left of the ear and define that a little bit better by using the eraser trick to add in overlapping hairs. And then the area that is to the far left of the ear, on that bottom, it sticks out too far. So I'm going to define that by pulling the background into that section of hair. I just get a really dirty blending stump and start adding in little slash marks that go into the hair, and then I can blend that out in a minute, because right now it pops too far out into the background and makes the cat's head look lopsided. I always knew that was going to be a problem, but it wasn't a problem that was so bad that it needed to be fixed right now. It was something that could be done a little bit later. When we start doing the background that's behind this cat, this thing will come to life in less than an hour. We have one more video to go after this, and that's mostly working on, or at least partially, working on the background. We'll do the background front to finish. We're going to do a little bit of time lapse on that though, but the video in real time, I think right now, is just over an hour. I just don't want to spend an entire hour showing me doing extremely boring details. I want to give you the main idea, and anyway, I won't get into how I'm going to do the video. Just know that the entire background I do in less than an hour, and then once I get that in there, the entire shape and posture and mood of the cat comes to life so fast. Now up close on this bottom right hand side of the cat's eye, the hairs are so small that they look like just little dots. So what I'm doing is I'm just making the shadows a little bit more defined and a little bit darker, and just barely touching the paper, I'm putting tiny little fuzzy dots all around that area. It's not a detail that people are going to notice from a distance, but it is one that they're going to notice if they get up close to the drawing. And those types of details count a lot in gaining the illusion of realism. Now we can start modifying that shadow that we talked about earlier, because remember I laid this in and said I'm just putting the idea of this in, then we're going to refine that later. Well, we're now to the point to where we're going to refine it, which means that we need to pick out little places in the middle of that little backwards S-shaped shadow, and we need to notice that right in the middle it gets much darker than on the edges. So I need to make sure that stands out a little bit more, because that's one of the details that defines the shape of this cat's nose and the bridge of its nose around its eyes. If I don't get those right, it's not going to look like the cat. We can have certain details that are off, but there are certain details that need to be pretty dead on in order for the cat to look like it does in real life. I will probably never get a drawing 100% perfect. And I don't think that's a thing that you should aim for just yet, especially if you're just learning to draw. I think that I would recommend that you worry about things like technique, worry about creating shadows and gradients, and getting comfortable and confident within your artwork. If your goal right out of the gates is to learn how to draw a picture-perfect masterpiece, you're going to sorely disappoint yourself. If I learn how to play guitar, I'm not going to jump in and try to play the fastest solo ever made. I just want to learn the techniques, get confident with it, learn to have fun with it. But if I tried to play an extremely fast solo right out of the gates, I'm going to get frustrated and stop playing guitar. So the goal here is not picture perfect. The goal here is to learn your shading, learn your fundamentals, learn your basics. Learn how to make it look basically real. There are things that are going to be off about your drawing, and you need to be fine with that. those will teach you more about drawing than the things you're doing right, at least in my perspective. Anyway, let's wrap this up for today. We have one more video to go, and this thing will be in the bag. Thank you so much for watching. If you're not already a Patreon member, please consider joining. I'll put a link down below the video, and thank you so much for watching.